Hey, so I looked through people's discussion board posts. In general, I saw very reasonable readings of the fairy tales, the sort of dissident works. I think because of the ambiguity that's necessary in dissident writing, it's hard for, myself or anybody else to say definitively, this is the reading of this, right? This is the interpretation. But I mean, what I saw from people generally were very reasonable interpretations, so I think that all went well. In terms of reviewing, I think the important thing is to think about and discuss maybe that ambiguity. We've actually got two different time periods happening here, right? So one is that we have the early Bolshevik period where you can be free in your writing, right? I mean, so we have somebody like Daniil Harms coming off the Bolsheviks, practicing his avant-garde absurdism, right? And he's free to do that, from 1917 on to, Lenin dies in 24, maybe about 1928. Stalin sort of comes to power, right? You have this entire sort of 10 years where people are free to express themselves in these ways, where Harms is free to demonstrate the absurdity of the world by writing absurd things, to play around with meaning in this way, right? And so, again, we have this very shifting idea of meaning because, for Harms, we have this sort of existential problem, right? The idea that meaning does not exist per se in the objects and events of the world. Meaning is something that humans project upon objects and events. And that's fine as far as it goes. Many people just say, okay, this is a collective projection and this is how we make meaning together. This is how we make signs together as people in the world. But for somebody like Harms, he sees that projection as a kind of falsity, right? That we're all fooling ourselves by attempting to project meaning onto things that do not actually contain meaning. It's a big falsification. And so he, in a sense, that meaninglessness opens us up for an infinity of meanings. And to demonstrate this in a very sort of direct fashion, he doesn't talk about it, he talks as if it is so, right? And so the four-legged crow actually has 5 legs and spills his coffee. What? Right? And you consider, and what Harms wants is for you to sit there and you picture a crow and then you try to imagine where the other 2 legs would go, and then you maybe have that worked out, but then there's a 5th leg. Where does that go? And then why is it drinking coffee? Right? He invites you to sit and try to make sense out of this, but the actual thing is that sense cannot be made out of it. That's the whole point. You can spend your time trying to make this make sense, but it doesn't. It just flatly doesn't. And he then invites you, in a sense, to extend this to the rest of the world, not just his writing, right? We sit and we try to make sense of it, and, either we declare that it can't be, or the problem is him, or maybe this, I know the answer, it's this, this is the interpreter, whatever it is. And he's like, no, you made it all up, it's all made up, it's just a crow with, there's no such thing as a crow with 5 legs, why does it just stop? And during this time, this avant-garde period, he's allowed to do that. Daniil Harms eventually dies in prison, right? And it's about this sort of changing world. We already discussed the idea of Soviet socialist realism and that sort of transition, right, under Stalin to new strident restrictions. But we see that even under those restrictions, you have people like Zamyatin. Zamyatin eventually has to flee Russia. Although not so far along as Schwarz. Schwarz is well into the Stalinist period and beyond, doing his work. Zamyatin flees Russia fairly early, I think maybe 28. In any case, right? And we come to this idea of Aesopian language, that, in a free society, there's signal and noise. Right? And when you're free to write anything you want, to critique anything you want, to say whatever you want about the government or anything else, you want your signal to be clear, right? You don't want a lot of noise in that signal. You want people to understand what you're saying, and you just do it as directly as possible. In a censored regime, you can't just directly put your signal forth, right? It will get censored. And so what we see is people, and Aesopian writing is a mode of writing, so it has lots of different techniques, so it's hard to pin down. But you know, you might switch up the genre, you might switch up the time period or the location. You know, Schwartz does that. Oh, it's in Germany. Oh, it's a fairy tale. Oh, it's back in ye olde times. You provide clues to alternative reading. So again, like Schwartz, this kind of like, oh, it's about Hitler, it's about the Nazis, we hate the Nazis. The idea is to create enough noise that the censor cannot reasonably say that, oh, this is, you know, this is about Stalin, this is about the Soviet Union, we can't publish this, and in fact we're reporting you for it, right? There is therefore this meta element to the writing. There has to be a relationship between the writer and the reader and the historical context. So first of all, if you don't know the historical context of a piece of writing in this mode, you will not understand it. You just cannot, because it's dependent on people understanding that it is about what is happening in the world around us and presents alternative points of view to what is happening in the world around us. So if you're not familiar with the context in which it's written, you literally cannot understand it. The other thing is the writer has to assume that the reader is going to be looking for hidden meanings. And this was true in the Soviet Union. People under censorship learned to read this way. It can be very difficult for us now because we're not trained to read this way. We don't have to. We're not trained to look for hidden signal in the noise, right? But that was how people understood writing to work during this period of time. And so people were on the lookout, and readers were looking for the hidden message, and writers were assuming that readers would do that for them. And so there's this kind of relationship. And honestly, there's also a relationship with the censors, because the censors knew that this was happening. And oftentimes there would be these kinds of negotiations, you know, like the censor would go to the writer and be like, take this out and revise this and we'll let this through. I mean, literally, this was a phenomenon. And so this kind of back and forth relationship to everybody. And the end result is that you get a piece of work that can be read in multiple different ways. It has to be able to be read in multiple different ways so that there's always plausible deniability. And so therefore, one, from our point of view, it's very difficult to say, or I would say impossible to say, this is the definitive reading of this. But it serves its function. It gets a dissenting opinion out into public in a way that hopefully avoids persecution, right, and censorship. I said Zamyatin died in jail, so things didn't work for him. You know, Schwartz kind of ducks this, right? Even though this play gets put on once, people, you know, officials see it and they're like, nope, 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 we're not doing this. And eventually it gets revived after his death, long after the death of Stalin. So, you know, but I mean, it's really about this mode, and that we can change genres, and we can change time, and we can change setting, and we can provide these different sort of allegorical or ironic readings. So there's many different techniques to this depending on the author, and the idea being that you are generating a sufficient amount of noise, and of course you don't want to generate too much noise, because then the signal is totally lost and even an attentive reader can't find it. But that you are generating enough noise to plausibly deny that your signal is a dissenting one, that there is some secondary signal that you can point to and say, oh no, this is totally legitimate, this is totally fine, this is exactly what you wanted me to write. But that there is also dissent that is decipherable under the right conditions to the reader, right? And so I think it's sort of fascinating to see that at work, and I think it's also fascinating to see how this gets more and more hidden over time. So Zamyatin's works, which are earlier than Schwartz's, you know, I saw a lot of people like, oh, clearly this is a critique of bureaucracy, right? And clearly it is. You know, he's a little worried about it, maybe, right? And I said eventually he flees the country, but, you know, he's still, we're not veiling things too much. The dragon is very, like, I mean, it can be difficult to sort of penetrate exactly, right? No, I think you can do it, right? I mean, it's clearly meant to be, and obviously, I said censor saw it, and we're like, nope, we're never putting this play on again. But, you know, we can see that over time, after, you know, Stalin's reign is consolidated, as things get more and more repressive in the country, you're at greater and greater lengths to make whatever you're, you know, whatever you're writing or whatever you're producing more and more opaque, right? To interject more and more of those sort of deliberately confusing modes to hide your signal. And so again, this also has to do with historical context generally, right? That we can go from these early free days of the avant-garde clear up to having to decipher whether or not Yevgeny Schwartz is actually talking about Stalin amidst, you know, a fairy tale about a German dragon. But as I said, I think that in general people were making plausible readings, and, you know, what's really important is to understand exactly how this dissidence and was being communicated, right? Because it's being communicated in this very specific, very Russian way. And of course, Aesopian language, you know, goes clear back to Pushkin, right? Because the thing to remember too about Russian history is that 10 years of the avant-garde was a new thing under the sun. It's not just the Soviets that were deeply repressive. It was additionally the Tsars, right? So in a way, the Russian culture has been conditioned to read this way for hundreds of years. And they were still doing it, right? Under Stalin and beyond, so. And then what comes afterwards, we talk about this week, so. Anyway, let me know if anybody has any questions. I put up a discussion board for this week, like we were going to have recitation, and we're not, I guess. And it's because in the actual syllabus, we did have a recitation this week, and then you took the exam next week, but then we lost that week, and I wasn't thinking about that. But, I mean, if you want a space to discuss Petrushevskaya, that's, you know, cool. Do that. Or to study amongst yourselves, actually, for the exam, you know, if you want to spend time studying together, you know, before you have to take the test, you can use it for that. Yeah, whatever. So, anyway, and good luck on the exam. And sorry you've had to listen to me talk so much today. It's like hours and hours of it. It's like an hour. Anyway, stay safe, stay inside, wash your hands.